Good morning, everyone. The keynote speaker today is Michael Ossmann. Michael is a wireless security researcher who makes hardware for hackers. He's best known for the open source HackRF, Ubertooth, and Great FET projects. He founded Great Scott Gadgets in an effort to put exciting new tools into the hands of innovative people, and I'll just add, like us. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, everybody, for being here this morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I appreciate that so many of you showed up, despite the fact that most of you probably have no idea who I am. It's really nice of you all to be here. So early in the morning here. I know. When did you have dinner last night? Like 10, 11? I'm the founder of Great Scott Gadgets. And Great Scott Gadgets is an open source hardware company. And we make tools for the information security industry primarily. Before starting Great Scott Gadgets, my background was in information security, and in particular, wireless communication security research. I'm a hacker. I frequently speak at security conferences, but this is my first conference having anything to do with physics research. It's been pretty interesting being here this week, and I attended the White Rabbit workshop on Saturday, and I've been getting to know some people. I've met several physicists. I've met several people who are quick to tell me that they are decidedly not physicists. One of the things I've enjoyed this week is hearing how everybody speaks so often and so kind of reverently about the beam. That's pretty cool. And another thing I've really enjoyed this week is seeing how excited everyone here is to be sharing their work with one another, because that's really exciting to me when I see other people who are excited to be sharing their research. I'm the designer of HackRF01, an open source hardware platform for software-defined radio. Basically, it's a test instrument that can transmit or receive arbitrary radio signals. And it's open source hardware. It's designed to be as low cost as possible. I started the HackRF project because I wanted a better tool for wireless communication security research and also for education. The thing that I've enjoyed the most about the HackRF project, however, is how I've been able to see people who use HackRF1 for diverse applications that I never imagined. It turns out that a few people are using HackRF in physics research. I've seen it used in biological research, like studying how sharks use electrical signals to detect prey. I've seen it used to cheat at video games by spoofing GPS signals. All sorts of things that I never thought of. And it turns out that low-cost, uncalibrated test equipment is useful for a lot of different things. Raise your hand if you're an inventor. I see a few hands out there. Maybe you've created some software or some hardware. Maybe you've invented something in your head but haven't actually produced it yet. It could be mechanical or electronic or visual or even virtual. It doesn't matter. It could be large or small. It's just something that didn't exist before, or something that is in some way better than things that existed before it. No? No more hands? Oh, a few more hands. Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah. Probably everyone in this room is an inventor in some way. And now, how many of you didn't raise your hand at first because you didn't think your creation qualified as an invention? Or because you don't fit your preconceived notion of what an inventor is? Now, when I was a child, people often asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I usually answered an electrical engineer or an inventor, and somehow that has turned out to be true. Both have turned out to be true, more or less, though I took a circuitous path to get here. I didn't study engineering in school. I didn't pursue a career in creating technology. I didn't learn how to design electronics until I wanted to build tools in order to accomplish other things. When I was young, I had a very distinct image in my head of what an inventor was. And recently I've tried to recall how this image may have been formed. Like, what role models created this impression? Edison? Frankenstein? Dr. Bunsen Honeydew? Now, when I was in school, I learned that Edison invented the light bulb, Bell invented the telephone, Ford invented the automobile, Marconi invented the radio, and the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Now, I've since learned that none of these things is true exactly. A century from now, I expect that school children will learn that Gates or Jobs invented the computer. I'm not joking. I really think that's what kids are going to learn in school, just based on my own education. For a wonderful case study, I recommend Bruce Boy's presentation at the 2015 Open Hardware Summit entitled, "What the Wright Brothers Can Teach Us About Open Source versus Closed Source." Bruce presents a compelling set of evidence that challenges what I learned in school about the invention of powered flight, even showing how Orville and Wilbur Wright, through a series of questionable legal actions, actually harmed the progress of aviation more than they helped it. Bruce argued convincingly that the Wright brothers set back the aviation industry in the United States 20 years behind other countries. 20 years. This was something that really didn't change until the Great War. And I think it was during the Great War that the United States actually took an unprecedented action to sort of create a mandatory patent licensing, group. Like you had to actually pay a small fee in order to be part of this group, in order to get access to the patents of the aviation industry. And this fee was fairly small because the US government wanted to get more people building aircraft during the war. And they had to do that because the Wright brothers were demanding extremely high fees. And there were hardly any airplanes built in the United States before the war, whereas there were well over many thousands of airplanes that had been built in Europe by that time. I learned in school that in the United States that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, an achievement credited in large part for setting the stage for the Industrial Revolution. Overlooked was the fact that the device more directly resulted in a large increase in slavery in the US. I also learned that someone else invented the cotton gin independently, and that Whitney's patent was later disputed. This was described to me as a shocking coincidence. Surely the probability of such simultaneous invention is minuscule because it violates our mythology of invention. In our mythology, the inventor is a man, which is stupid. The inventor works alone, which is stupid. Sometimes the inventor has one assistant, but the assistant is not acknowledged as a contributor, which is stupid. The inventor spends a tremendous amount of time in his laboratory or workshop, which is the one part of the mythology that is probably correct, yet it disagrees with the greatest myth of all, that the invention is the result of a single, tremendous, transcendent moment of inspiration. Eureka! The Eureka moment is the core of the mythology of invention. Breakthroughs arrive supposedly not by climbing one step at a time, but by leaping to a great height all at once. The capacity to achieve such acts of genius is what separates inventors from us mortals. It is why, I think, most of us hesitate to call ourselves inventors. We don't want to be seen as arrogant, self-proclaimed geniuses, or worse, as crackpot practitioners of pseudoscience or chasers of the next big consumer craze. We don't want our creations compared to the light bulb. Neither do we want them compared to the jump to conclusions mat or the pet rock. I don't know why the Eureka myth is so powerful. It seems to be something we want to believe, despite all evidence. It extends beyond inventors to all sorts of creative people. Mozart, it is said, held in his head the entire Jupiter Symphony, his longest, in a single moment. Can you imagine? A single instant. I think this is ludicrous, but that's the story. The Eureka myth, by the way, is the title of a book by Jessica Silby. As I developed the ideas for this talk, I started calling this whole mythology of invention the Eureka myth. And eventually, I looked it up to see if anyone had used the phrase before. It turned out to have been independently discovered more than once. Most notably is the title of Silby's book that presents evidence that challenges the mythology of invention quite effectively. Simultaneous invention, or multiple discovery, is in fact the normal way that most inventions happen, not the rare exception I thought as a child. If you take the time to investigate the origin of almost any major technological breakthrough in history, you'll find that the mythology doesn't agree with reality. Progress is made in small steps by many people, not in great leaps by a solitary genius. Eli Whitney was involved in patent disputes, not only with one person, but several. Some were independent discoverers of similar technology. Some made incremental improvements to Whitney's cotton gin, which was itself an incremental improvement to existing technology. If you were somehow able to go back in time and identify all the independent inventors of the cotton gin, you would probably end up with a long list of names. And it is possible that Eli Whitney would not be among them. It is moderately likely that he took the idea from a woman he knew or a black slave that he owned, but women and slaves weren't granted patents in those days. When I was young, I dreamed of one day holding my own patents. I hoped that I could be one of those special people with the gift of inventive inspiration, that my Eurekas would somehow make the world a better place. I didn't realize at the time how absurd the patent system is. Patents confer a government-granted monopoly to the single genius creator of a great new technology. The system makes sense, however, only if you believe the mythology of invention. The supposed benefits to society are that patents incentivize invention and that they result in the publication of ideas that would otherwise be kept secret. And this publication advances science and technology in a way that's useful for society. The publication benefit is actually easy to refute. At least in the United States, it is common in the technical industries for commercial engineers to be advised not to read patents for fear of accusation of willful infringement of those patents, because the penalty for willfully infringing a patent is much greater than inadvertent infringement. I do not read patents. If the creators of new technology actively avoid reading the patents of other creators, then their publication can have only a negative impact, not a positive one, on the progress of technology. Now, if you choose not to read patents, you won't miss much. In general, technology is pretty easy to reverse engineer, right? We all took things apart when we were kids, right? It's literally child's play. The other benefit of patents that they incentivize invention is easier to believe. Our mythology tells us that invention is a rare occurrence, that inventors are special people without whom we would languish in a dark age. The reality, of course, is that invention is a normal thing that humans do every day. Ask yourself why you invent things, small or large. If the people sitting near you raised their hands earlier, ask them later today, what motivates their creativity? I bet you'll hear things like, I enjoy being creative. I like finding better ways to do things. I try to give back to those who create technology I use. or it makes my job easier. I bet you won't hear people say, I patent my inventions and that's how I got rich. There are a lot of people these days talking about patent reform. In the US in particular, they usually talk about software patents or business process patents, and they propose reducing the reach of the patent system in some way. Now, I do not support patent reform. In my opinion, patents are harmful to society and they should be abolished. The harm caused by patents is easy to see. By restricting new technologies to just one producer, they slow the adoption of technology and make it harder for others to make incremental improvements. The only justification for the patent system is that it produces more benefit than harm. But the benefits only appear to exist if you believe in the mythology of invention. Around the turn of the century, I had an idea that might have been patentable. I had recently moved to the mountains of Colorado. Driving on a windy road one dark night in my mountain town, I nearly hit a deer. It was standing right in the middle of the road. I didn't see it at first because it happened to be standing just past a fairly tight turn, just to the left of my headlights until I completed my turn. Unfortunately, I was able to stop quickly enough to avoid a collision, but the moment of fright got me thinking, why were my headlights pointed in the direction my car was facing, not the direction my car was turning? Wouldn't it make more sense to have headlights that swivel from side to side as the steering wheel turned? I thought that my idea from that moment of inspiration was pretty good, and I thought that instead of messing with my existing headlights, I could experiment with a third headlight mounted on the car. I never did retrofit my car with an experimental headlight, but a year or two later I saw an advertisement from Lexus touting the exact same idea, steerable headlights. What if I had already applied for a patent for the idea? What if I had started a company to develop it, holding it as a trade secret? Would I have been justified in assuming that Lexus had stolen my idea? Would I have felt compelled to sue? Now, as it happened, I don't think I ever told a single person about this idea, so I easily concluded that it was independently invented by someone else. My idea may have been good, but it was not unique. Over the past few years, several automakers, including BMW, Mercedes, Toyota, and Volvo, have been sued by Adaptive Headlamp Technologies Incorporated in the United States for infringement of a 2007 patent for headlights that swivel when the steering wheel is turned. Adaptive Headlamp Technologies Incorporated is a subsidiary of an intellectual property licensing company, which is another name for patent troll. When I heard about the lawsuits, I recalled that old Lexus advertisement. And I did a quick search to confirm that yes, in fact, Lexus was shipping this feature years before Adaptive Headlamp Technologies had a patent. So I searched for other prior art. Guess what I found? A car called the TUKPL01 had a third headlight that swiveled as the steering wheel turned in 1948. Automakers today are actually spending money defending themselves from recent patent claims about technology invented more than a half century ago. My moment after almost hitting that deer was a Eureka moment. I think we've all had Eureka moments in our lives. We just haven't had the big one yet. We're like gambling addicts, convinced by our small wins that, we'll someday have the big score. And I think that may be one of the reasons we want to believe the Eureka myth, because we've all felt that. But the big score, the big Eureka, is a myth. The Eureka that is a big idea, not a small one, is something that doesn't happen in real life. It's a story we concoct when we tell the tales of past inventions. Small Eurekas do happen in real life, and they They occur to many different people at roughly the same time. Eurekas can be wonderful experiences, and they can lead to great things, but don't be fooled into thinking that a Eureka is unique. Society will not be deprived of an invention just because one person didn't follow up on a single moment of inspiration. The better the idea is, the more likely it is that someone will have or already has had the same idea. When I tell people that I support abolishing patents, I get some strange looks. Evidently, this is considered a radical notion, but it seems pretty obvious to me. Even if I can convince someone that ideally we would be better off without patents, my listener typically suggests that an abrupt transition would be too difficult, that there would be unintended consequences of that transition. It's the same argument that many people make when opposing marijuana legalization. I live in Colorado, one of the states that is leading the way toward marijuana legalization in the United States. So let me tell you about unintended consequences. Tourism is up. Tax revenue is up. Teen marijuana use is down and is below the national average. Now, admittedly, there have been some negative consequences. It's problematic, for example, to drive a car from Colorado into neighboring states. There have been a lot of reports of law enforcement in nearby states where marijuana is not legal, kind of stopping people and maybe not entirely legally stopping people who are driving in from Colorado and searching their vehicles. I've also heard that we're having a problem with unemployment amongst prison guards. Sometimes what appears to be a negative consequence to an individual is actually a great benefit to society as a whole. Now, I haven't been able to confirm this rumor about prison guard unemployment, but what I have found out while I was researching this is that prison guards are among the major opponents of marijuana legalization in the United States. Do you know who else opposes legalization? Pharmaceutical companies. Apparently they're more concerned about the sales of their patented drugs than they are about sick people feeling better. When the Nobel Prize is handed out, it is increasingly given to more than one person. I've heard some folks say that this is due to the fact that science has progressed to the point at which no single person is able to make major achievements. There just isn't any low-hanging fruit out there anymore, supposedly. Now, in certain areas of research, it is true that groups are required. I'm sure you're all well aware of this. But in general, I think it is nonsense that individuals are less able to contribute to science than they were in the past. History is jam-packed with people claiming that all the discoveries have already been made, and they're always wrong. Sometimes multiple Nobels are given to independent discoverers of the same thing. It isn't uncommon at all. And it may be that modern communication technology has made it more apparent when multiple discovery occurs. Sometimes Nobels are given to a team of collaborators. Now, if scientists are collaborating more than they once did, I think that's great. But it is probably a sign that modern technology has made collaboration easier, not that collaboration is more necessary than it was in the past. Another possible reason for the increase in multiple Nobel winners is that collaborators may be more likely to be acknowledged today than they were in the past. Have you heard of Rosalind Franklin? Some of you probably have. Some of you probably haven't. But I bet you've heard of Watson and Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for their work on DNA that was based on her data. Now, I have mixed feelings about the Nobel Prize. I think it's great to honor those who advance science. But the prize seems to perpetuate the mythology of invention, especially by having a policy that a prize cannot be given to more than 3 people. It is a disservice to humanity to insist that the most important scientific contributions cannot come from groups of 4 or more people. The folks who somehow produce idea after idea are my favorite people, not for the value of any one idea, but for their spirit of inventiveness. Most of them will never even be considered for a Nobel Prize. Now, there may be Nobel Prize winners or future Nobel Prize winners in this room. Would you like to be one of them? There is one way to make absolutely certain that you will not, and that is to refrain from publishing any of your ideas. Hold your best idea in your head. Keep it secret. Don't let anyone know about that precious gem you've stored there, except it's not precious. Your idea has no value until you do something with it or tell someone about it. Part of the Eureka myth is that you only need the right idea to make $1 million. It could be something simple like the pet rock or the bread climp. The truth is that implementation matters. No investor in the world is going to fund your technology startup based on an idea alone. How are you developing your idea? Who are your customers? How have you proven that you're capable of delivering something your customers want? What makes you more likely to succeed than your competition? An idea is a seed, but seeds are all over the place. Successful businesses are seeds that have been planted in fertile soil and have found the right amount of water and sun over a long period of time. It takes work to turn an idea into a product, and it takes even more work to deliver that product to satisfied customers. Thomas Edison famously said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. I've heard Edison recently called the Elon Musk of his day. But somehow, despite that quotation, my childhood image of Edison was more Doc Brown than Elon Musk. Now, Jessica Silby, author of the Eureka myth, wrote that when they describe how and why their company succeeds, it is not largely or solely because of intellectual property. It is because of loyalty, relationships, reputation, a copacetic workplace, the excellence of their products and services, first mover advantage, private agreements, an attentive and understandable market, and a constantly evolving offering of complementary products and services built around identifiable marketplace needs or desires. My company, Great Scott Gadgets, makes open source hardware tools for the information security industry. Something I did not anticipate when I started my business is how difficult it would be to explain to people what I do. The elevator pitch for Great Scott Gadgets requires an unusually slow elevator. First, I have to convince people that hacking is a worthwhile endeavor. And then I have to explain open source hardware. And it turns out that this is the significantly higher hurdle. When I started making hardware, which really wasn't all that long ago, it seemed perfectly natural to me that my hardware should be open source. I spent many years in IT, starting long before it was called IT, and without exception, every single thing I did in my career that I was proud of was something that I did with the help of open source software. I wanted to give back to the community that had given me so much. For me, making everything I produce open source, software or hardware or whatever, it isn't an option. It's simply the right thing to do. Now, elevator people often ask me if I have patents. I ask them if they'd like to join me on a longer elevator. Usually, though, I avoid the subject of patent abolition and of the ethics of open source. Instead, I tell them how ineffective patents are, especially for small companies. Every successful product gets cloned these days, patented or not, open source or not. By making my products open source, I disseminate my inventions as widely as I can. I give my ideas the greatest possible chance of having a positive effect on the world. And everyone who hears about one of my creations, one of my ideas, is a potential customer, even if they were exposed to my creation through a clone. Sure, you can buy a HackRF or any number of other HackRF clones from China. But if you hear about HackRF and you search for it online, you'll find my company as the first search result. Now, the marketing angle has the elevator people half convinced by the end of the ride. And I think the reason they're only half convinced is they can't let go of that old myth. They think that great ideas have great value, and that by giving away my ideas, I'm losing value. When I'm away from home, I enjoy traveling with a toy guitar to entertain myself. It's great. It's cheap. I don't mind beating it up. I can throw it into the overhead bin on an airplane. It gives me something to do when I travel. Let's say you were to sit down with me and try out my guitar. You like it, so you steal it from me. I would be sad, because I wouldn't have my guitar anymore. I would be deprived of my ability to play it. But let's say that you sat down with me to try my guitar and you do not steal it. Instead, you leave having learned a song that I wrote. I would still have the guitar. I would still have my song. I would be deprived of nothing. I reject the notion that scarcity increases the value of ideas. The opposite is in fact true. Ideas have value in proportion to how much they are shared. If I ever decide to stop selling open source hardware and instead pursue a career in music, the popularity of my songs would be directly related to my ability to sell tickets to performances. This is exactly what elevator people don't understand. Ideas have value in proportion to how much they are shared. Your ideas are worthless until you share them with the world. Now, this notion is hardly anything new. Even in the hacker community, Don Lancaster wrote in his Hardware Hacker column in 1988, "I would like to be able to report to you that ideas are still worth a dime a bale in 10-bale lots. It is only when an idea is both converted into a form that people can use, and in fact are actually and aggressively using it, that the idea gains any value." In the following issue, he wrote, "I'm sorry if I did offend one or two patent attorneys and one or two others who do seem to be personally profiting from this very sorry state of affairs. I also extend my apologies to their BMW dealers." In the debate between soft science and hard science, you physicists seem to have the advantage. Hackers do science too, but it is a mixture of both hard and soft. We study computing systems, creations not of nature but of humans. Much of what interests us is how humans use computers and how there are strengths and weaknesses in systems, whole systems, that include both technological and human elements. A growing segment of the information security community, however, studies harder aspects of computing technology. For example, in recent years, there have been great advances in formal verification of computer programs. It is now possible to mathematically prove the correctness of many programs. Researchers in the LangSec movement are taking a language theoretic approach to computer security. They look at information systems and see interfaces between various components. An interface could, for example, be a user interface that accepts input directly from a human, or it could be a network interface that accepts input from another computer, or it could be an application programming interface that accepts input from some other code running on the same computer, maybe even linked to the same process that is handling the input. Anywhere input is processed, LangSec researchers point out that the input can be thought of as a language, and that the language's complexity can be classified according to a hierarchy that existed for decades in the field of linguistics. Now, more complex languages require more complex input processing, and it has been shown that only the simplest languages can be processed with computer programs that can be proven to terminate on all possible inputs. This is very interesting to me. The halting problem, known since the early years of computer science, tells us that more complex languages require input processing that may never end. If you can't prove that your program terminates on all possible inputs, you can't possibly prove that it correctly processes all possible inputs. The security of every computing system, therefore, depends on simplicity of input languages. The astonishing result of this work is that by simply combining decades-old linguistics research with decades-old computer science research, we can see that most modern information systems have no hope of ever providing any security guarantees. If you want security guarantees, you must, at a minimum, specify input languages throughout your system that do not exceed a certain complexity. It may seem strange that the application of linguistics, the study of natural languages of humans, to computer science, the study of machines created by humans, yields a hard result regarding the provable correctness of computer programs. I am frequently astonished by this myself, but it is a result that I cannot refute. So I encourage everyone who creates information systems to pay attention and to define protocols and interfaces with a grammatical simplicity that will allow future security guarantees. The information security community includes both hackers and academic researchers, and the LangSec movement is an example of something that was started by a small number of people at the intersection of those two groups. Now, I think it's probably the most exciting work that's going on in the information security industry right now, and I don't believe that this is an accident, that it happened at this intersection between hackers and academics. I believe that there are some things that hackers do well, and there are other things that academics do well. And we have much to learn from one another. Hackers are good at finding one provable aspect of a system with many unprovable characteristics. When presented with a security claim, hackers like to show how the claim is false. You say your software is unbreakable. Well, here's one way it's already broken. We love doing that. And I think one of the reasons we love doing that is because it is something concrete. It is one provable thing. And we love proving things. There is a saying in the hacker community, you can't argue with a root shell. And what this means is that when somebody points out how your system is broken, it's an irrefutable proof. Sergey Bratis, one of the key members of the LangSec community, has pointed out that an exploit is a proof by construction of the vulnerability of a system. Hackers are terrible at writing things down. We share information, but we often share our most important results in presentations at conferences without any written paper. When we do write things down, it's often in a blog post or an informal publication like FRAC or the International Journal of Proof of Concept or Get the Fuck Out. Now, these are wonderful publications, but they lack the rigorous peer review of academic journals. Believe it or not, much of the most important knowledge of the hacker community is perpetuated in an oral tradition. Hackers are good at scheduling conferences. In a city where dinner isn't served until after 9 p.m., hackers would not schedule the keynote to start at 8:30 in the morning. I'm just making sure you're awake. Hackers are not always good at citing past research. In the information security community, hackers often cite other hackers, and academics often cite other academics, but neither group is particularly good at citing research from the other group, or even being aware of research from the other group sometimes. Hackers are good at open source. And this is perhaps the most important thing, I think, that academics can learn from hackers. Hackers created the infrastructure of the internet out of open source software and open documentation. And they've called the internet home for as long as the internet has existed. Open source software and now hardware is a tremendously important part of hacker culture. When we share deliberately. And we do everything in our power to ensure that others can take advantage of the work that we share. One thing we do not do is publish findings behind paywalls. Now, when I was invited to speak at this conference, one of the first things I did was to look for papers from the last conference in 2015. And even though I did not find the full text in any central place, I was pleased to be able to find every paper I looked for, complete with a Creative Commons attribution license available on the web. And I want to thank all of you for publishing your work in this way. Sadly, there are still many notable journals that do not provide open access. In my opinion, there is no excuse for this in the 21st century. The most important thing you can do to advance science is to disseminate your findings as widely as you can. In this century, that means you must make your work available freely online. It's so easy to do technologically, there's no excuse to not do it. If you're publishing research in 2017 behind a paywall, I'm not sure what you're doing, but you are not doing science, in my opinion. Another important and often overlooked aspect of science is the repeatability of experiment. Now, if you're publishing a paper but hiding your data, if you aren't sharing software that is central to your research, if you aren't describing your equipment in sufficient detail for someone to reproduce your experimental apparatus, then you aren't doing science. These words may sound harsh, but I hope you'll give them some thought. We live in a world today in which the value of science is disputed. There are political voices growing louder every day, telling people that science is a system of beliefs, not a mechanism for finding truth. There is one great thing that you can do to demonstrate the value of science, and that is to do the best science you can. Share your results as widely as you can. Share all the information necessary to reproduce your results. Convince readers of your papers how you've avoided fooling yourself into believing a false conclusion. Share all your evidence. If you don't, you'll plant seeds of doubt that undermine confidence in science itself. I recently reread Cargo Cult Science, the famous lecture by Richard Feynman. Now, if you haven't read it, go read it. If you have read it, go read it again. I don't think there is any living scientist who wouldn't be inspired by that speech to do science a little better, with a little more integrity. Every contribution you make, every paper you write, every line of code you publish, every hardware design you place under an open source license serves to advance science. If there's one thing that should be apparent to everyone here, it's that you are a part of something greater than yourself. The achievements of this community, perhaps more so than any other scientific field, are made by the efforts of large groups of people. Your ideas are worthless until you share them with the world. So I encourage you to go forth and share them in every way you can. Thank you.
As you can imagine, here in ICALEPCS, we're a big family. People, we know each other since a long time. Most of us, we're in the business of making controls and data acquisition for big physics facilities. But in our family, there's one member missing since a few years. It's ITER, the big fusion laboratory in the south of France, who actually don't come because there's a lawyer who doesn't agree to let them publish their papers with a Creative Commons license that we use. Now, I was wondering, since you are used to making elevator pitches to potential investors, do you have any insight or any idea of how you would pitch to people, in particular tech transfer people in public institutions? Do you think public institutions are anything special, or the same pitches should work that you use with investors?
That's an excellent question. I think there are multiple approaches that are worth taking. I hope that I've given you some food for thought for how to talk to other researchers about the importance of open access and open source technology and dissemination in every way you can. And I would imagine that everyone here who publishes research wants their research to have the greatest impact that it possibly can in the world, and that's an easy way to convince your fellow researchers that that there's a benefit to them in seeing their research have a greater reach. But when you're dealing with policymakers, perhaps it might be a little bit more similar to challenges in speaking from an open source hardware company to an investor, for example. Someone who's more in a position of control, potentially, but who is not the person actually doing the work or doing the creative work or coming up with the research. And that's a little bit different. And I think it's important to realize that you can't necessarily make the same arguments, but there are arguments that can be made. There are things that you can point to, and perhaps the greatest thing that you can point to is the fact that everyone else is here. That so many important facilities around the world that are doing this kind of work do share in every way that they can, or are trying to be better about sharing with each other. And that's what getting together at this conference is all about, of course. And you can point to your successes at other facilities and say, we're able to accomplish this because we have collaboration. I would hope that might be helpful.
Thanks.
Question here?
There's one in the front and one in the back.
Oh. What was the other question?
I have one comment regarding your comment that what is the difference between university and science. I do not know the single student who wake up at 8 o'clock. And maybe this is also why there is a lot of hackers in students' communities. I mean at student level, but later they are like losing their spirit, and they are converted more and more to closed source community and this company policies. Do you have any advice how to prevent this? I mean later with the grades, and they became professors, and they usually lose the spirit of hacking.
Well, that's sad to hear. I've certainly seen it, but I've also seen the opposite. I've seen people in university programs who become more excited about a field of research or a field of study over time. And so I think it's balanced somewhat. Now, I don't know as much about university systems in other countries, but in the United States, we have kind of a sorry state of affairs where a very large percentage of university research programs have a technology transfer focus, where they're trying to patent technologies, and they're trying to get their researchers to start technology companies, and they're trying to produce proprietary for-profit results, even though many of these institutions are in fact publicly funded. And I think that is something that we as a country in the United States, we need to change. That certainly publicly funded research institutions should not have that kind of private proprietary focus. And I would hope that by focusing more on open publication in many of these institutions, that we will help inspire students to do more work and to be happy pursuing science and hacking.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for a very inspiring talk. But I think, my question is, I think here we're talking a lot to the converted, the people already convinced of open source. What do you think about large companies? I mean, do you think it's probable or even possible in the future that we'll find large companies that are based on open source? And I think of, examples like Microsoft, who are claiming they're embracing open source, but I really have a strong doubt that it's actually, that they've really changed the DNA. I mean, what do you think?
That's an excellent point. I do think that we are seeing more and more open source in larger companies, particularly open source software. Now, open source hardware is a younger idea. It isn't as mature, and we don't have as many successful companies to point to and say, here's how open source hardware works commercially. But we do have many growing companies. Actually, in my home state of Colorado in the United States, we have a number of companies. Now, my company does like $2 million of annual revenue, and we are not even in the top 5 in the state of Colorado. The number 1 open source hardware company in Colorado is SparkFun Technologies. Probably many of you have heard of SparkFun or ordered components from SparkFun. They're quite large. They have, I think, over 100 employees. I don't know how much their company is worth, but probably hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a pretty big company. It's not big compared to, say, Microsoft, but it's bigger than a lot of people would expect when they hear what open source hardware is and what an open source hardware company is like. I think that, but in the open source software world, we've definitely seen, like Red Hat, for example, which is $1 billion open source software company. That is a big number. And I think we are going to continue to see growth in open source companies. It's just a long process because we have these biases that we're fighting against. It's not easy to overcome those biases. It's not easy to overcome the mythology. But if there's one thing that I hope you've gotten out of my talk this morning, it's that a lot of the myths that define the way we do things and the way bigger companies do things are simply myths. And if we challenge the perception of those myths, we can change things over time. The larger companies are going to change more slowly, and I think that's perfectly natural. All right, thank you all very much.